Firstly, I'm very grateful to the Academy of Sinology and the University of Wales Trinity St David for giving me this opportunity to talk a bit about the subjects planned for the Academy's English Bachelor's Program. And the subject is based on a text called The Essentials for Bringing About Order from Assembled Texts. Okay. This book on the right here is a relatively recent edition published by the National Library of China in Beijing. And this book actually comes to us from a period of the 7th century in China, known as the Jinghuan era. And that was the reign of Emperor Taizong, who is depicted here on the left. Now, what I'm going to do, I think some of you may already know about this book. It's otherwise known as the Governing Principles of Ancient China, and say that some of you may know or have heard about this through this series of books called Governing Principles of Ancient China 360. The series has come about because in recent decades, parts of the essentials for bringing about order from assembled texts, which I'll call essentials for short, it's a long name, parts of the essentials has been translated into various languages. And we have here, for example, Arabic, vernacular Chinese in both traditional and simplified forms, English, French, there's German, Japanese, Russian, Spanish, and Vietnamese. So what I thought I might do, instead of focusing on the content of the essentials, I'm going to talk a little bit about the text, the historical background of the text, introducing the text and its historical background so we can have some idea of, how it came to be compiled and, what's so special or significant about this compilation. So as the name suggests, Essentials for Bringing About Order from Assembled Texts, it's an anthology, and it's an imperially commissioned anthology by Emperor Taizong himself. It contains extracts from pre-existing literature that span 3 out of the 4 traditional bibliographical classifications of Chinese literature, and that would be the canonical or classics, canonical writings, the histories, historical writings, and the masters, or also called the philosophical writings. And there are 68 sources altogether. And then some would say that it would belong to the literary tradition called the Mirror's Four Princes. And this is an ancient tradition of literature designed for the moral and political education of state leaders. And this is because the Essentials was designed to help the young Emperor Taizong to develop the ethical character and the cultural literacy, as well as get up to speed on the formal learning that traditionally considered essential for governing the empire. Now, the historical record shows that, after the end of the Sui dynasty in the year 618, and the Sui dynasty sort of preceded the Tang dynasty, Taizong was then known as Li Shiming. He was then just a prince. He helped his father to settle rival claims to sovereignty and subdue rebellion against the newly founded Tang dynasty. And when Li Shiming succeeded his father to become the second emperor of Tang China, he was only 28 years old. And it had been less than a decade since the fall of the Sui dynasty. And, reunification of the empire under the Tang rulership had only been finalized about 2 years earlier. So it was still very much a fledgling Tang dynasty. Now, Emperor Taizong, he was conscious that his career as a military commander and strategist had left little opportunity for the formal scholarship and learning required for statecraft and government. And but not only do we know from the historical record that Taizong overcame the odds, but he came to be recognized for consolidating the fledgling Tang dynasty. So sort of Taizong the consolidator. That's not my words, that's the words of the historian Howard Wetzler. Now, the Tang dynasty was a dynasty that went on to last for almost 300 years. We have the dates here. And Emperor Taizong himself ruled for over 20 years. Now, later courts in China, as well as overseas, found his leadership to be exemplary. And the name of his reign period, entitled Jingguan, became synonymous with good government. So his practice of government came to be known as the good government of Jingguan. Now, as you may know, the Tang dynasty is celebrated as a golden period of cultural flourishing and economic prosperity. And it's been regarded as the second great age of Chinese empire, widely regarded to have surpassed the first age, the first great age, the Han dynasty. Now, Tang China is known for many things, from poetry to porcelain and technological innovations. Perhaps most importantly, it's been credited with the Tang tradition. Now, what's the Tang tradition? Well, the British historian Charles Fitzgerald writes about the Tang tradition in his biography of Emperor Taizong, so the biography of Li Shiming. And he writes that before Taizong's time, before his reign, unity in China had been the exception, the achievement of a few strong dynasties. Feudalism and partition had been the rule. But from the 7th century onwards, China has far more often and for far longer been united rather than divided. Partitions have been the consequence of partial foreign conquest or a temporary interlude between strong dynasties. Always, the Tang tradition reasserted itself. So what is it? Well, that tradition of unified empire, administered by a civil service, taking its orders from one supreme central authority, was the life's work of Li Shiming, was the legacy of Emperor Taizong, and it has maintained and spread in the Far East the Chinese culture, one of the great civilizing forces in the world's history. So notice that the establishment of the Tang tradition, this enduring tradition of a unified empire administered by a civil central authority, is actually accredited or attributed to Emperor Taizong. Taizong out of all of the emperors of Tang China. And I think that when we look at the essentials for bringing about order for simple texts, as being a text that was put together for Emperor Taizong near the start of his reign, this text presents a unique window into the classical scholarship and the political discourse underpinning one of the most successful rulerships in China's history. So, in fact, the Tang historian David McMullen has described essentials as follows: the 7th century equivalent of a sizable encyclopedia of political wisdom intended to save the emperor reading time. It offered an efficient route to minimum learning, and that was what Taizong needed. The British sinologist Dennis Twitchett has also described the essentials as being very frequently referred to in Japan as an authoritative source on politics and the sovereign's role. I'll talk a little bit more about the significance of the essentials a bit later. So, get the idea that the essentials was really, it's called the essentials. What Taizong, he's having to learn on the job as the emperor, probably fairly busy, a lot of things to do, not a lot of time to study, only interested in what he really needed to know. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about now is explore why was it commissioned? Who was involved? What happened? Was it actually used? Was it approved by Emperor Taizong? And as I mentioned before, to what extent was it meaningful? Was it significant for later courts after his rule? Now, if we look at the preface to the text, and it's a preface by Wei Zheng, who's the chief editor for the compilation. We get an idea of, the literary challenge confronting Taizong in the early days of his reign, and the reasons giving rise to this imperial commission's terms of reference. Wei Zheng writes that Your Majesty finds the writings of the classics bewildering, and masters, the philosophical writings disparate. Analysing exhaustively the principles, natures is fatiguing yet futile. Reading extensively without perspective broadens knowledge without much grasp of the essentials. We are therefore being ordered to select from diverse texts, excise the irregular, irrelevant, and illuminate the exemplary standards. So, that Taizong is described as finding the extensive literature bewildering and disparate. You really get the sense that it was difficult for him to know where to start, how to read effectively. And he sort of needed his advisors, his officials, to try and provide that clarity and order. And they certainly did so by selecting not only the relevant texts that he needed to read, but the most important parts, the most essential parts to provide governance. So to provide him with the guidance for governing, including the model standards and practices. Now, you might be wondering, well, why didn't he just consult one of the books in the palace library? Why did he have to compile a new one? Go to the trouble of putting a new one together. If we look at the palace library collection, these figures are based on the monograph on literature in the Sui dynasty, and that was compiled by Wei Zheng, actually, during the Jingguan reign. And it gives us an idea of the size of the palace library collection. It was about over 14,000 texts, consisting of almost 90,000 scrolls. That's a fair bit to read. Well, you might be wondering, well, what about just the texts on government then, on statecraft? You don't need to read every single book in the palace library. Well, here I've listed two compilations, and they're actually identified in the preface by Wei Zheng. And one was put together in the 3rd century, the other in the 6th century, and they come to, they're both over 600 scrolls. Now that's fairly voluminous. And incidentally, they're compilations, as I mentioned, and they include their extracts in order of topics or subject. And we'll go into this a little bit more. Now, as the emperor mentioned before, having to learn on the job, you're pretty time poor. So he was only interested, Taizong, only interested in what he really needed to know. Well, if we look back at the preface, Wei Zheng explains that the essentials actually is fairly compact. It draws from the classics to the various masters, spanning, the earliest times of Chinese history through to the Jing dynasty, and it comprises 50 scrolls altogether. Compared to over 600, this is, compact. This is great. And it primarily seeks to capture the gist of governance, and that's why it's entitled The Essentials of Bringing About Order, at least in English. So get the idea that it's compact. Here, there's a bit of a translation of the contents pages. Scroll 1 has the preface, and 1 to 10 includes all the classics, extracts from the classics, followed by extracts from the historical writings from 11 to 30, and then from 31 onwards all the way to scroll 50, you have the master's works, the philosophical writings. And notice that the extracts are categorized by their source, so it probably made it easier. Taizong wouldn't feel mixed up, where, having to remember which quote comes from which book. Having these sort of probably made it a more handy reference, basically. Now, than being a more reference, it was also more concise reference. This is also from the preface, and Weijing sort of distinguishes the essentials from other writings from recent and ancient times by emperors and princes, where they compete in the use of ornate language and the dissemination of preposterous notions to flaunt their conversancy with trivial scholarship, embellish their limited skill. So, the essentials is serious. It's about, statecraft, and they pay particular attention to keeping the language clear and concise. And in a later paragraph, unlike other reference books, the Essentials compiles the essential readings from diverse texts under a new title to facilitate a complete understanding without extraneous information. Each extract is materially complete, so it's aims to be comprehensive, and each matter is related in form. So, going backwards. Now, I talked about the Imperial Conspectus and the other comprehensive digest following convention in grouping by subject. And this is also from Weijing's preface. And he sort of points out that, well, there are some certain downsides to that approach. Terms and entries reiterate each other, the introductions and conclusions are disorganized, the text and its meaning are disrupted, and the usage and study of them is difficult. So we can understand that there would be repetition or overlap. We have in the scope of the topics or subjects, and sometimes duplication, where one passage could be relevant across multiple topics. So Weijing identifies the faults of existing compilations, and at the bottom here, I've included a passage from the first book chapter in English about the essentials, and it's by Fan Wang. And she observes that she compares the editorial approach between the Imperial Conspectus and the essentials. And she makes the point that while the compilers of the Imperial Conspectus, the Huanglan, dismembered the original texts, drawing attention to themselves as the organizing intelligence that weaved heterogeneous textual fragments into a coherent moralistic narrative. Well, the essentials foregrounded the coherence of the original works. Its legitimacy derived from the authority of the classics per se, from things that she would also mean the sources per se. Didn't really mix them up, kept them in the order and through its arrangement by source. So why was it commissioned? It's commissioned to provide a concise, comprehensive statecraft for Emperor Taizong. Now, who was involved? There were 4 editors. We've mentioned Weijing already, and he was, I suppose, by virtue of his role as the director of the Palace Library at the time, he was the chief editor. And more than that, prior to being the director of the Palace Library, under the reign of Taizong's father, he had served as assistant in the Palace Library department. So you could say that he was probably familiar with all that the Imperial Library had to offer for this project. And Taizong obviously entrusted him with the, probably preferred his approach to learning from the historical past by entrusting him with overseeing the writing of no less than 5 of the official histories for the preceding dynasties here. Now, interestingly, it's notable that during the early days of the Jingguan reign, the court was divided as to the administrative direction that the rulership should take. And it was actually Weijing who recommended Taizong to implement a Confucian model of government, a government that was centered on education of ethical character and leadership by virtuous example. So perhaps it's probably no surprise that Weijing plays a key role in being the chief editor of the Essentials, being supposed to educate a book, supposed to educate Taizong on how to govern. Now, this is a passage from the Essentials of Government from the Jingguan era. And this passage is attributed to Taizong, where he explains that, at the start of the reign, people all disagreed, saying that at the time it was certainly not possible to practice the imperial way, Huang Dao, the way of a true king. It was only Wei Zheng who urged me on. And this is the reference to the Confucian model of ideal government. And, after following his counsel within just a few years, we've achieved peace in the civilized world. And what has enabled us to reach this point is all due to the efforts of Wei Zheng. So you can really get an idea of the high regard Taizong has for his chief editor. Now, after Wei Zheng, is next listed, and he was part of the academic elite. He was also serving as the vice director of the Palace Library at the time. He was entrusted with educating the Crown Prince, as we can see depicted here, and also entrusted with the drafting of texts, like the history of the Liang dynasty that took place during the reign of Taizong's father, and the Records of Extended Territory, which was a comprehensive gazetteer of the empire. This was under Taizong's rule. Now, Xiao Deyan was so highly esteemed by Emperor Taizong that he was compared to these historic Confucian exemplars. Now, I'll probably recognize the first 4 names as being prominent scholars, prominent students of Confucius. Now, Yan Hui and Min Ziqian is recognized. They were recognized in the Analects for being distinguished in virtue. Zi You and Zi Xia were distinguished in, recognized for their distinctions in erudition. Xiao Deyan is mentioned in the same breath by Taizong as these Confucian exemplars. Now, Fu Sheng, some of you may know that he's credited with saving the Classic of Documents, one of the 5 classics. And as the legend goes, he was an erudite during the Qing dynasty. And what he did was he risked his life, basically, to conceal a copy of the classic, the documents, in the wall of his house when the Qing dynasty, Qing government was those sorts of books were being burned and banned by the Qing government. And after the end of the Qing government, the Han government tried to recover lost texts. And Fu Sheng, who was already in his 90s at the time, he was able to recover the text, retrieve the text from the wall of his house. And, well, some say that instead of retrieving the book from the wall of his house, he actually recited the whole text from memory. And not only that, but he provided instruction on the text itself. And it's actually Fu Sheng's version of that classic, the documents that we read today. And last but not least, Yang Zhen. He lived during the 1st century, during the Eastern Han dynasty, and he was immensely learned in the classics. Before he became a government official, he devoted his efforts to the cause of education, so, insisting on universal access to education. And he taught so many students that he became known as Confucius, the Confucius west of the passes. And that's Yang Zhen. So Xiao Deyan is esteemed by Taizong, mentioned in the same breath as these legendary Confucian exemplars. Now, then there is Yu Shenan, so the academic elite. He put together this concise discourse on emperors and kings for Emperor Taizong, helping him to learn from the historical experiences of past rulers. He actually succeeded Wei Zheng as the director of the Palace Library from the year 633. And there's an anecdote where Taizong actually describes Yu Shenan as a walking library. As the story goes, one time, Taizong was about to embark on an inspection tour. His attendants asked if he needed his books to be brought along as they were preparing the imperial carriage. Taizong replies, "Oh, that's not necessary. Yu Shenan will be with me, and is a walking library. I've heard of walking encyclopedias before, but Yushinan is a complete library, mobile. Obviously saves Taizong reading the books himself. Now, you can get an idea. Well, before I go into that, Taizong actually praises Yushinan for his distinctions in 5 areas: for moral virtue, scholarship, dedication, writings, and calligraphy. And we sort of get an idea of the close working relationship between Taizong and Weizheng and Yushinan, where from this passage attributed to Taizong, where he remarks that in recent years, when we have held court to oversee affairs or taking our leisure and enjoyment within the parks and orchards, we've always summoned Weizheng and Yushinan to attend and accompany us. Sometimes we have planned and discussed the business of governance together, or discoursed on scriptures, the classics and canonical texts. The enlightening things we've often heard have not only brought benefit to himself, but one could say that this was the way to lasting peace of the dynasty's state altars. So, you get an idea of they worked closely together and his extremely high regard for his editors. And last but not least, we have Chu Liang. Now, Chu Liang was also a member of the academic elite. I'll just have a look. He served Emperor Taizong as a senior recorder, as well as a military strategist, often accompanying him on military expeditions. So basically, all 4 editors, they occupied, senior roles within the Jingguan administration. They were highly trusted. They had the trust and confidence of their ruler. They were equipped with expertise and the cultural knowledge necessary. They were very familiar with Taizong's needs, his preferences for learning from the past, and his political vision going forward. So that's really what they brought to the project that eventually became the essentials for bringing about order from assembled texts. Now, what happened after that? After all the work that was put in, it was completed in the year 631, and it was warmly approved by Emperor Taizong. How do we know? Have a look. In the same month that the essentials was presented to the throne, Emperor Taizong actually personally wrote this reply to Weizheng as the chief editor. And he writes, reading what has been recorded, we are impressed by its comprehensiveness and conciseness. We've discovered matters that were hitherto unknown and unheard of. It enables us to bring about order by studying antiquity and oversee matters without any doubt. Isn't such accomplishments great indeed? Weizheng and the others are to be given 1,000 bolts of plain silk and 500 lengths of coloured silk. The Crown Prince and other princes are each to be given a copy of the essentials. So Taizong certainly appreciated that the essentials provided comprehensive coverage. It was concisely expressed, found it to be helpful for understanding the past and overseeing matters with confidence. Not only did he generously reward the editors for their efforts, but he must have found it useful enough to order copies for each of the princes. Now, besides this initial response, there's evidence that the text went on to become a book that he consulted regularly. In a memorial to Emperor Xianzong during the early 9th century of the Tang Dynasty, the scholar official Li Jiang wrote that in the past, Taizong also instructed Weizheng and others to comprehensively select the deeds from each era and compile the essentials for bringing about order in diverse books. Then Taizong kept the text at the side of his seat, and he would constantly study and reflect on it. And this is an official serving in the courts of one of the later Tang emperors. And he's commenting on the fact that, well, essentials was regularly studied by Taizong. So it seems that the book was with Taizong's approval, and he read it off. So removed the question mark. Now, as for the extent to which it was significant for later courts in China and Japan, well, we know from historical records that beyond the Jingguan reign period, beyond Taizong's government, the Essentials was known to and or read by some emperors of the later Tang dynasty, as well as during the 19th century of the Qing dynasty, the final sort of period of imperial government in China. In between, there were several centuries where the text was actually lost. But interestingly, the Essentials has enjoyed relatively uninterrupted transmission in Japan, where it's been studied by generations of the ruling elite, from the heavenly emperors to the shogunates, over some 800 years since the 8th century. So such historical evidence sort of supports the idea that the Essentials served as a source book for theoretical discourse underpinning Emperor Taizong's practice of government. And it sort of goes some way to helping us understand how and why his rulership became exemplary and exportable. And it offers insight, obviously, into the learning within the tradition of mirrors or princes. This text designed for the political and moral education of state rulers. Now, I'll end with this particular image, and it's an image from the website of the Tokyo National Museum. And this is actually the oldest extant edition of the Essentials. It was discovered after World War II, and it's acquired the status of national treasure in Japan. Sadly, only 13 of the original 50 scrolls have survived, and 7 of those 13 scrolls are now accessible online through the e-museum of the National Tokyo Museum. So I think that gives us a bit of an introduction to the Essentials for bringing about order from assembled texts, a bit more understanding of how this compilation came to be compiled, and just an inkling of how it became significant during its time and for later courts, both in China and Japan. So thank you very much for your attention.